Today I'm wearing my beautiful disaster shirt that says, "You don't know my story." There's nothing stronger than a broken woman who had to rebuild herself. That's what the back says. You know if I'm wearing it, then it has some personal significance to me. About 2 years ago, when my book had just been released, I met a local shop owner. I had been shopping there for a while, and we always had friendly conversation. When she found out that I had written a book, she said, "You are so inspirational." She said she always felt better after speaking with me, and she said she'd love to carry my book in her store. So she bought some books and some water bottles. On the day that I delivered them to her store, I had to leave and go back and get some display materials for her. When I returned, she told me that someone had came in while I was gone, and she said, "They told me your story. I'm not carrying your book." I have to say I was a little taken aback. I felt blindsided. I said, "I tell my entire story in the book." She said, "Oh, they told me all about your story. I'm not carrying it." Then she said, "But I'm not going to judge you until after I've read your book." It was at that point that I wanted to laugh. I was stunned by her ostentatious sense of superiority. What gives her the right to judge me whether she's read my book or not? What I didn't say then, but what I'm saying today to all of the people out there who like to think that they have the right to judge other people: you think you know my story, but I've survived things you know nothing about. I lived a nightmare. I was trapped in the devil's playground for my entire childhood. My monsters weren't hiding underneath my bed. They were in it. And then I had to have breakfast with them the next morning. You have no idea what ghosts haunt the hallways of my soul. You like to say things like, "I would have never done the things she did," when the truth is that you have no idea what you would do. You may very well know what you think you would do if you were in my situation, but you base that on who you currently are. You base that on being equipped with your DNA and your lifetime of experiences. You didn't live in my home. You didn't exist in my world. You didn't grow up in my body. You can't even fathom what you would do if you had my DNA, were raised by my parents, and grew up in my home environment. It's actually quite arrogant to sit back and say what you would ever do in someone else's situation when you can't even remotely put yourself in their shoes. If you haven't danced with the demons that frequented all of my formative years, how dare you tell me how I should have survived? The next thing that uninformed, judgmental people like to say is, "Well, she may have gone through that as a child, but she got to choose how she acted as an adult." There's a tiny bit of truth to that, but do you honestly believe that when the sexual abuse I suffered for years came to an end, so did the trauma? Let me help you out with that erroneous thought. That's not how trauma works. Trauma has no statute of limitations. One doesn't expunge trauma. Trauma waits and it festers. It sits in the control room of your soul, quietly directing all of the calamities of your life. As long as it remains unresolved and unhealed, it will poison every beautiful thing that begins to blossom in your life. The survival skills I learned as a child turned into incredibly unhealthy coping mechanisms in my adult life. A lot of people don't understand that concept, so here's an example from my life to help make it easier to understand. As a 9-year-old little girl, I was trying whatever I could, everything my little brain could think of to avoid being raped after school. I started saying I was sick at school. The school would call my mom to come get me, and she had to take me back to work with her because my teenage brothers were still in school and I couldn't be left home alone. So I avoided the nightmare for that day. That lying and manipulation became a successful survival skill for a while, until she told me one morning, "I know you're not sick. You better not have that school call me today." One can always ask the question, why didn't she question what was going on? She missed it, like so many parents do. But my 9-year-old brain became a 10-year-old brain, and then an 11-year-old brain, and I was constantly developing whatever tactics I needed to in order to survive the nightmare that I couldn't escape. My brain was forming and developing the entire time. When I became an adult, my brain didn't magically say to abandon those survival skills. You don't need them anymore. That's not how trauma works. We are talking about trauma that had never been disclosed or allowed to heal. Trauma makes its mark. It tattoos itself on your soul. So I dealt with the rest of the world with the only skills I'd ever learned my entire life. There is scientific medical evidence that proves what I'm saying. MRI scans of adult brains of people who experienced trauma as children are very different from scans of adults who didn't experience trauma in their childhoods. The areas that are affected are the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, and those are the areas of the brain that affect judgment, consequential thinking, impulsivity, and the fight or flight response. I have a master's degree in counseling and was a licensed professional for 27 years, and I didn't realize this. When you are the person with the affected judgment, you don't realize what's happening in your life. You don't realize why you make the poor choices you make. Think of all the people you know. I'm sure there are many of them who are wonderful people, but they do some things you just don't understand. Why does she sleep around? Why does he cheat on his wife? Why does she drink too much or smoke too much or eat too much? Why does he do cocaine every day before work? Why can't she keep a job? Why does she go to church and then gossip about everyone and spread hate everywhere? Why does he hit his wife? Why is she rough with her kids? I'm sure they don't realize what their why is either. People say to me all the time that they don't know why they have the issues they have. Perhaps they have unresolved issues from their childhood presenting as those other issues. There are many factors that affect how debilitating trauma is to each individual person. There are numerous different triggers that can cause trauma to resurface. People can think they've dealt with it, and something happens to trigger it, and it's right back as if it was just yesterday. I'm not going to go into all of those today, but suffice it to say, trauma affects everyone differently. On one hand, you can have a professional person existing behind the facade of success, but allowing the shame of abuse to be the catalyst for addiction after addiction and the self-destructive behaviors I spoke of earlier. And then you can have a homeless person who is a drug addict. Two very different looks, but the same brokenness underneath. Let me remind you, you don't know my story. You don't know anyone else's story either. So where do we go from here? Try being kind. Be kind. Be compassionate. It's easy to be kind to people who are your kind of people. But what about the people who are struggling? The people who are hurting? The people who have made mistakes? Those who are beaten up and wounded by life? The people who are fighting battles you know nothing about and are walking through storms God didn't ask you to walk through? Be compassionate. The next time your friends come to you with gossip and they want to speak disparagingly about someone else, perhaps for the first time in your life, respond with, you know what? We don't know her story. Her behaviors scream that she's a person in pain. We should be compassionate. If that's hard for you to imagine yourself doing, maybe you don't have the compassion, kindness, and love for others that you think you do. Here is where I challenge every one of you. Compassion is just like a muscle. The more you work it, the stronger it gets. Let your compassion, kindness, and love for other people grow. The only way we will ever begin to heal this incredibly broken world of ours, a world that is full of people who just don't get it, is if we start practicing compassion and kindness. In every situation, you have a choice on how you respond. When you choose compassion and kindness, that's a choice you'll never regret.